together. First, I wanted to share that I'm presenting in the Bay Area, in the unceded Ohlone territory in the San Francisco Bay Area. And click on the next slide. Thanks. As part of the land acknowledgement, I also wanted to encourage everyone to check out the American Indian Library Association's Read Native project 2021. It's really cool. I would encourage everyone here, if you're not a member, to support the association and to consider joining and participating in its activities. Next slide. So as people are coming in, I wanted to ask everyone here, how are you feeling right now? It's been quite a month in January, and today has been a lot of, perhaps interesting moments we're experiencing. So please feel free to type in the chat box and using one of the numbers that signifies how you're feeling at the moment, whether it's 1 to 5 or 9. Great, we see 1, 5, 8, 4. Yeah, I tried to also balance between the animals, between dogs and cats, and then of course one bird, just in case people are fans of birds. Yeah, a lot of 8s I'm seeing. Yep, 7, definitely. 1. No 4s? What's the scale again? Is 9 or no? There are no good or bad, but it's you just sort of choose how you're feeling right now. Internally, 1 because of the new admin in DC. Great. 2 and 8, 6, 4. Great. Well, thanks for participating. I wanted to give everyone a chance to feel like they're able to express how they're feeling. And when we move on to the next slide, I wanted to ask, where are you right now? And please feel free to share in the chat box your location and affiliation. And if you don't want to share your location, you can also share if you're working at home or at work. And really thank you all for participating. Great, we got people from LA, Toronto, working in the office, Germany, France, Vermont, Alabama, Minnesota, Atlanta, New Mexico. It's like scrolling really fast. So I'm like, my eyeballs are trying to keep up. Virginia, Fresno, Syracuse, Texas, Toronto, South Carolina, DC. Very, very cool. I'll give it a few more seconds here if folks want to chime in if they're working at home or at work or where they're coming from and their affiliation. Great, thank you again for participating. We can go on to the next slide. So I'm a school and academic librarian, and in a solo role, I support all library services and support in terms of research needs. And I've been an academic and public librarian before and pretty active in the American Library Association's policy and library advocacy committees. And as a result, those works have informed my work in broadband and as well as understanding the digital divide issues. And right now I'm also serving as the President-elect and Vice President of the Asian Pacific American Librarians Association, known as APALA, which I'm really honored to be serving because it's quite an important group that we're focused on the APIA community as well as library workers. And so with all of these culminating experiences that I'm sharing, it'll all come together into how I am informed into this research that I'm sharing with you today about digital divide and broadband issues impacting communities of color. Next slide. So first, let's talk about human needs, right? And you might be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs by psychologist Abraham Maslow in 1943. It's from a motivational theory in psychology of human needs. The lower needs, if you can see here, needs to be fulfilled before individuals move up. And you see actually like self-actualization, self-esteem, belonging, love, safety, physiological. And in the next slide, you'll see that Wi-Fi has become quite an important area. It's become foundational because of COVID-19 has really affirmed that need. And so this adaptation like meme, as you see, resonates with many communities lacking broadband access. That in itself has been quite complicated, which we'll really get into. Next slide. As I was working on my dissertation early last year, and in the beginning of COVID, there were constant discussions in the literature in policy matters on digital equality, equity, and digital inclusion. All were used interchangeably and at times have nuanced meanings from what I gather, right? Within the policy scope, within the literature. And so really broadly here, digital equity is about the dissecting the analog and digital aspects of political, social, cultural, economic dimensions of society today. and ultimately striving to ensure that we do not widen inequalities through digital technologies, according to Nanjira Sambuli, a Kenyan researcher, writer, and policy analyst. While digital inclusion is about access to affordable broadband, internet-enabled devices, training, and support to achieve digital literacy, according to the National Digital Inclusion Alliances. And then we'll move into digital equity in the next slide. Thank you. And so when we talk about digital equity, it's a little bit different. And for this purpose of presentation, we're gonna use digital equity to include the other two definitions. And what this means is that for our library users being impacted by the lack of broadband access or the enduring issue known as the digital divide, digital equity means, in the next slide, a condition in which all individuals and communities have the information technology capacity needed for full participation in our society, democracy, and economy. Straightforward definition, right? But it's actually quite complicated because we're still thinking about those who have and don't have, but we're not including other areas, including abilities, infrastructure, speed, skills, language access. Just to access the broadband and internet and infrastructure needs to be considered. And it's not as binary as a lot of people would like to think and categorize. And in the next slide, please. We'll see that we're going to look at digital equity before and during the impact of COVID-19. Schools and universities were greatly impacted, and of course, libraries. And what we found out during this time is that people of color are more affected by this issue compared to white people. And in numerous studies by Pew Research Institute and the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, racial disparity in digital access have been deemed really critical. One study found that children in 1 in every 3 Black, Latinx, and Native American households did not have broadband access at home during COVID-19. So these alarming statistics on digital exclusion experienced by communities of color continue to serve as a crucial discussion points for policymakers, educators, and communities collaboratively. And we know that for public libraries, it's quite different. Now we have public libraries and institutions opening and closing or being forced to flip to the digital. And that in itself has severe implications. We have millions of people who still don't have access. And on top of that, we're finding out that students and children and even teachers don't even have internet access or at least stable connection at home. So people without digital access, they can't complete their schoolwork, they can't apply for job housing, they can't apply for all sorts of areas, including subsidized healthcare support. And we found that based on these research, many people have said that 9 out of 10, the internet has been critical during this time, especially COVID outbreak. And it's really essential that we think about broadband access. And internet inequality existed before the pandemic, and now the situation has exacerbated for many millions without internet access or public library access. And for general statistics here, we have about 25 million people do not have internet access. 33 million people do not use the internet too, and about 162 million people are not using the internet under broadband speeds, according to Microsoft. Next slide, please. So then we come up with this question called digital privilege, right? We see this emergence of people who might be able to work from home, who might be able to have stable connections and access to the internet. And so I want to specify this emerging concept for the purpose of this presentation, digital privilege, which is looking at how people access the internet and how they're not being afflicted by these limited constraints and high-speed issues that other people are experiencing. And what do I mean by that? And in the next slide, we're seeing types of constraints here. The first constraint we're looking at is in an environment that's rooted in inequality and equity, people who are able to have digital privilege, have access to means and resources and the infrastructure and skills to the computer and internet without these constraints. And we also see that content and policies reflect and benefit and really privilege those individuals and experiences and over others. So there's that inequality in itself. In the next slide, we also see these other areas that I think are part of the digital privilege experience. People who have experiences in information literacy skills, knowing how to navigate the web to the best of their abilities, right? and the idea of information privilege, which is the idea that information access is based on individual status, affiliation, or power. And they also might be aware of privacy literacy and tracking. They might know how to set their settings on their phones or on their computers and really disable the data collecting that's happening. They have that awareness, while some people simply cannot afford to do that. They need to rely on it, whether it's for their work or some sort of means to get by. And I also want to stress that they may have access to their own community in terms of data. And as a result, we know that when you have access to your own community data, you are able to advocate for your communities in a more effective way. And oftentimes there are limited data on communities of color being impacted by major issues in the United States, such as the digital divide issue. And I think that shows the lack of resource, priority, and or interest of the government to not really think about those community data. And if you have access to that, that in itself is a privilege. I support a lot of school teachers who are educators in training and becoming really full-fledged teachers out there. And part of it is they have to conduct an action research project, which involves community data across the state of California. And many of them cannot find that data piece, whether it's in their government or a nonprofit or other research sectors, because it's just not a priority for those organizations to really consider that. That's how we're thinking of it. And of course, if you're able to work from home and not have your job jeopardized, that's certainly part of the whole privilege, right? Having that access. And I'm not saying all of these equals to digital privilege, but I'm saying more or less. And having these benefits do mean you have some sort of digital privilege. But let's talk about those who don't, and how do we learn from those who don't? In the next slide, we're going to look at critical race theory. And what does this have to do with digital access, digital broadband issues, and why does it matter? So before we get into the issue of critical race theory, I wanted to go back into what had happened in the fall most recently. An executive order 13950 on combating race and sex stereotyping was issued on September 22nd, 2020 during the Trump administration, sanctioning funding to all programs or trainings related to critical race theory, white privilege, and any training that suggests that the United States is, quote, inherently racist or evil country, or that any race or ethnicity is inherently racist or evil, end of quote. And so with that being said, during that release, universities, schools, and libraries that rely on federal funding for such training, or even positions that focus on diversity efforts, were scrambling to sort this out of compliance. And more interestingly, on Monday, the White House shared its final report from the 1776 Commission, quote, presenting a definitive chronicle of the American founding. And what we're finding out yesterday and today, President Biden will be issuing an executive order denouncing this, which we won't get into the talk, but I do want to highlight how critical race theory has been into our national discourse, so focused, so closely tied. But what is it? Why is this theoretical theory so important? And how do we understand broadband issues as a result? Next slide, please. So critical race theory, for those who are not familiar, started in legal scholarship. And it's an idea that race is a socially constructed category that is connected to the experiences of the users, particularly people of color. And understanding race and experience in a fundamental critical way in the workplace, in the community, who has power, who doesn't, what are the lived experiences that are not being told, the power structures that are there that are not necessarily obvious, but embedded in policies, in our interactions with others, right, who are in a dominant position. And it's all connected to broadband access. And in the next slide, we see that CRT has a role. And I wanted to stress that first, I connect with my research using critical race theory through a qualitative study, through interviews with participants of color who are public libraries users of color and how they use their libraries. And we'll get into that. But for this part, I wanted to emphasize that there are a lot of tenets under CRT, 5 core tenets. And this one tenet I wanted to highlight, which is storytelling, an approach of understanding and amplifying oppressed voices, enabling people of color to communicate their white counterparts, matters that the whites are unlikely to know. So applying CRT through storytelling can really highlight those power structures that exist in digital access, equity, and public libraries. Next slide, please. So one of the things that has happened over the year is that we think about storytelling and understanding that it is more than simply data and statistics. And storytelling really gives us the fuller picture, things that we couldn't capture through data and statistics. And this is an enduring issue, right? The broadband issue has been around for quite some time, digital divide issues. And do we know the communities' stories from communities of color who are impacted by restricted and limited broadband access? And what are their barriers and perceptions? And so you see here that, and we all know this, digital divide is more than simply digital access. We have issues in speed, skills, abilities, infrastructure, resources, technology, and so forth. And to really dismantle this stereotype of the digital divide, we have this meme that I created a month ago for some project here for fun. It really showcases how it's not really you have computer and then you don't have internet access. There's going to be a lot of trade-offs here. And now what we're seeing is schools and universities flipping the digital narrative might need to rethink how they deploy their hotspots, computers. All of it is psychologically and financially unsustainable. Do our children and students have a place to study? Content that supports accessibility needs? Effective assignments? What about public libraries and their users? We know prior to COVID-19, many of them who use the computers in public libraries apply for jobs, healthcare, subsidized housing, completing schoolwork, connecting with family and friends, learning new skills. And so my research really focused on those constraints when they use the public library and when they're not having access at home. And what are these constraints? Next slide, please. And so we come across and learning all the barriers and the perspectives. Using CRT, we really start uncovering what are their experiences that we did not think about, right? Because of the way our institutions have set up policies or services that they might see as constraining to their digital access. And here's what I found. Next slide. So these are some of the experiences for the two types of constraints. The first is circumstantial, right? When we talk about circumstantial, what impacts their experiences, why they did not have digital access and the reliances on public libraries in California, right? These are public libraries of users of color who experienced digital divide in California and what they encountered prior to COVID-19. So first is, of course, many of them in this sample group have said that they go to school, they can't use or go to the library during the day. They have a job, so they can't go to the library at night because it's during the day. Or they live far away from their libraries. So that means it's quite a commute because the closest library is still pretty far away. In addition, another personal constraint is the internet's too expensive. They don't want to subscribe to it. Or where they live, there's an infrastructure issue. They can't subscribe to it. And family, they have children at home and potentially they don't want to have them accessing the internet so early on because it might lead to potentially cyberbullying, privacy issues, concerns, and so forth. So these are circumstantial and personal constraints, as I like to call it. But then we find another type of constraint, and in the next slide, you'll see that these are institutional constraints. These are what I uncovered in my interviews with the participants. For instance, they mentioned, well, in the public library I use, there's a 2-hour limit. I can't access more than 2 hours. And also there's a lot of people. I can't really do my schoolwork. I have to really focus, right? Or I can't apply for jobs because there are viruses. It freezes up the computer. Library service hours. There are limited opening and closing times. I can't use the library during the weekend, right? And these are the people who are experiencing digital divide and they rely on their public libraries to get access. There are no workshops, no technology workshops to show me how to use and create email to a certain extent, right? And no language support. There's, as some have shared, there are no speakers in the library staff who can speak in Spanish or Hmong or other languages that's reflective, right, of their needs. And of course, there's the representation question. Lack of diverse library staff. They don't feel like they're able to ask another library staff to help them with technology needs. And so these are institutional constraints or barriers in the public libraries that the participants have shared with me. And in the next slide, I wanted to mention that there is a difference between the two. And so circumstantial constraints cannot be changed, right? These are personal ones, and these are ones that people cannot, we cannot do anything about. They have a job, they live far away from the library. But in the next slide, institutional constraints can be changed, all right, institutional ones, because they're all related to policies, resources, right? And the stories from our users tell us what and why they feel strongly about these issues. Institutional constraints tell us what the institutions prioritize and what they see are their way of maintaining status quo or maintaining sense of order or power or sense of compliance, right? But is this reflective of our community's needs, especially communities of colors who are impacted by broadband issues? That's the fundamental question, right? What can be changed? So in the next slide, here's what can be changed, right, based on the discussions. So first, 2-hour limits. You can expand the 2 hours for your computer, change the access policy, add more computers, update the computer system, add more hours to the libraries, recruit more staff that's reflective of your diverse communities, right? Hire staff that could speak the languages that reflect your community. And as a result, they can potentially offer technology training to the communities and in those languages. And I want you to think closely about these policies and resources in your own libraries. What can be changed and recentered for our users, right? And so when you start thinking about from the user's perspective, you start thinking, well, these might be potentially doable. And of course, it all comes down to the work that the libraries do in providing access, but we also have to think about what are they still doing that mitigates access. And I followed up with 2 participants during COVID-19 last year and their experiences. And as a result, we know that the libraries are closed at that time. And one exclaimed to me, I want to be human beings again, because literally my children are like eating each other in the house. Another shared that she was very upset since she lives close to her library and said, my phone is so small, like it messes in my eye. I can't keep staring at my phone for long periods of time. It's kind of saddening. So we start hearing these stories of how they're impacted when their libraries are closed. But even before COVID-19, we're starting seeing these barriers that suggest that these could be reduced or mitigated so that they would have fully access to digital access in their experiences and in their work and the libraries. Next slide. I also want to remark that people of color are not a monolith. There are a lot of different experiences that were shared. This is not necessarily used to generalize all people of color's experience. So I'm going to say this again. People of color are not a monolith. All communities have different needs and interests and experiences, and we cannot simply group them together like a monolith. These needs and barriers were rather different for individuals. They express agency in making choices, and that must be considered, right? And as a result, next slide, the digital equity issue is very complicated. It's not a one glove fit all issue. They all have circumstantial issues, of course, that I shared some of them, but also the ones that they thought were institutional barriers, right? And so they were all giving me different point of views that were helpful, but certainly we must remember that this is not a sort of a one canvas solution as well. We need to consider each one in an equitable stance. And next slide. A while ago, I was asked this question for a presentation I gave on digital exclusion, and it's a good question. I didn't get a chance to answer it due to limited time. Can digital equity be achieved? Next slide. TBD, to be determined. It's a shrug emoji. I actually am not sure whether this issue can be achieved, whether we can actually get everyone to have affordable and good access, right? One side of me thinks probably not, even at this rate, because of how poorly addressed this issue was prior to COVID-19. And COVID-19 does not enable opportunities here, only exacerbate this issue. And so it makes me think, how and what will happen going forward. And so next slide. However, I am cautiously optimistic that the Biden-Harris administration may address these issues. As yesterday's inauguration showed us, new leadership may think about broadband issue that works for our communities immediately. Biden's Build Back Better plan, a response for intersecting health and economic crises, calls for universal broadband for every American. It doesn't get any more specific than that, but we're all looking at it very carefully, at least for my work, looking at broadband exclusion. One thing to note is that we know the nation's priorities, but by how and what they spend their resources on. Just look at the federal budget. And hopefully there will be strong considerations for Congress to really address this issue on broadband access, particularly impacting communities of color and low-income communities. And what's really exciting is that the FCC was recently announced an acting appointment. So that hopefully will get into more discussions going forward with this administration. I'm cautiously optimistic about that. Next slide, please. The role of broadband in the discussions of COVID-19, certainly, it's ongoing. It's not going to stop even after when we manage this pandemic. So as I shared in the website, or at least Dr. Cook and Grace Jones has shared on the website, there's a Urban Libraries Council released a new article, case studies on how public libraries are addressing them. And it's important to think about these issues and how to bring the case studies to your stakeholders. Next slide, please. Even before COVID-19, the Digital Equity Act was proposed by Senator Patty Murray of the Washington state. So I want to dial back for a second here. Before COVID-19, what was being discussed? And it's pending in the Senate Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation. And I also like to think that even if it garnered bipartisan support, then Senate Majority Leader and now Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell may have this bill sitting on the desk and have not gone anywhere. You could see how important it is, providing digital literacy skills, improving online accessibility, empowering rural communities. It does seem promising to really propose and authorize $1 billion in federal grant funding over 5 years to support digital inclusion programs across the United States and its territories. However, there are so many discussions that need to be had, and even for rural communities, which I don't really get into in this presentation, and tribal communities, which are deeply impacted by digital divide issues, they need to be addressed and looked at. And I think this Digital Equity Act could have had potential, but unfortunately, like many bills last year, they're just sitting in the desk and basically unable to proceed any further. And hopefully with this new administration and Congress, we'll be able to see something more clearly coming through. Next slide. And now we see a silver lining under the pandemic, right? There's some things we could think about. We see that schools and universities are becoming more aware of the issues of online learning, privacy, the needs to address broadband access for teachers and students, addressing it in a critical way. Of course, this is still really complicated, and it seems to be changing month by month because of how the virus is impacting communities and schools and operations. And libraries are thinking ways to make it sustainable too. We know that libraries are lending out hotspots and using technologies to really engage with the communities, and then tracking that data, right? Collecting that information to see and understand their impact. And the silver lining is we're going to have more data-informed decisions going forward. And hopefully that will be in consideration for new bills to be passed to really address it. But next slide. But ultimately, libraries as community anchors should not solve universal broadband issue alone, nor be the only institution addressing this issue. So since of March 2019 to right now, I've attended so many webinars on digital divide issues, many of them by major key players. And unfortunately, I don't see libraries being in those discussions. And it's really interesting to see where are libraries fitting in. And it's quite surprising at times, because they want to engage with the communities in terms of broadband support. These institutions, government agencies, nonprofits, corporations. But now we're seeing also libraries being sort of the champion of broadband issue, but they shouldn't do it alone. They need to collaborate with all these other groups to make it happen. And they should not be, the only one doing it too. And that's something I really want to address. So where do we go from here? Next slide. We need to think about the internet being a public utility, a public good for all. The government should consider directing or organizing a comprehensive funding program to broadband deployment across all throughout the country and its territories. Maybe not so much of the state distribution the way we're seeing it, because this is a national priority. If it were to become a public utility, and I'm not sure how it would look like, would it fall under heating or electricity bills, and would it be under certain regulations, and what would that look like? Internet service providers must be required to provide affordable high-speed broadband to all people in the United States. And this is an issue that I found during my own research. It's been the cost, right? But I wanted to say that people have decided not to subscribe to the internet. They have financial means, but that was sort of like the secondary reason why they don't subscribe to the internet, because they have their public libraries, and then they trust their public libraries and they like to use it. But now we're seeing that cost is a major issue for many communities, particularly communities of color, and we need to address that. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we all carry some forms of digital privilege, right? All of you are attending this webinar, and we, at all levels, we are library advocates, and this is a call to action. We must advocate and champion for change in all levels for digital equity, inclusion, and equality in our communities, because we want to support a thriving community where they have access and so forth. And it's so critical because we're here right now, we need to make use of it. But what else can you do? Next slide. Contact and engage with your legislators, acknowledge their work. Some of them, such as Patty Murray and also Senator Jack Reeds from Rhode Island, have been major proponents in the library support. And we need to continue working with them and engaging with them, engaging with the new FCC, who is thinking of broadband being a high priority. And it's going to be quite exciting to see potential breakthroughs in these areas. Write op-eds, participate in social media advocacy, use the hashtag municipal broadband to really see what's being discussed in terms of turning the internet as a public utility, potentially. Participate in association work, ALA, as well as your state chapters are all major players, right, to get this going, have these discussions going. As I keep hearing from my friends in the library world, teamwork is dream work. We have to do this collectively together. Not one person needs to do this alone. And I want to say that in a profession that's predominantly white, in the next slide, we must listen to and believe the experiences of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, library users, and colleagues. You know, this is so important because when we don't listen to their voices, when we discount their experiences, we don't see these institutional constraints that are happening, like I addressed. We do not recognize what options are there. And I want to say, not necessarily because I'm a BIPOC library worker, but because I think it's important when BIPOC folks feel understood. We see options that we couldn't see before, right? And so I think when we start thinking and engaging with our colleagues of color and also our library users of color, we start hearing different perspectives that are not in the dominant narrative in the digital divide discourse, right? It's just, oh, you need the internet or you need a computer. No, it's much deeper than that, right? And so, in the next slide, I want to just share some of the resources, but we'll share it in the slide deck. Next slide. And also want to give acknowledgement to SlideGo for their template. Next slide. And that is pretty much it. Thank you for your time and attention. And I look forward to your questions or comments you have. And I appreciate all of you for joining in.
Thank you, Ray. That was wonderful. So everyone, we have time for questions for Ray. If you want to put them in the chat box, Ray, do you have access? Can you see the chat box, or I'm happy to read them to you? Okay. Yeah. So we have plenty of time for questions and conversations as people are typing in the box. So much to think about. I thought it was particularly intriguing and a really excellent question when you were talking about the internet being a public utility and what does that look like. And it's I think something that we have to be talking about and thinking about. And you know, another point that you made about libraries not being invited to these meetings. So how are we going to change that? Is it just a matter of outreach, or if you have thoughts on how we are going to get ourselves to these tables for these decisions?
Yeah, that's a tall order in terms of getting into these conversations. And I think if you see them, whether that's through your ALA or state level chapters or anything you see on the social media, to really join and ask questions or participate and follow through. It's one that I try to go to as many and then follow up with some of the speakers, right? And say, look, we're libraries doing a bunch of great works. Here are some reports and findings. I can connect you to people who speak on this, and maybe we can have some call to action moments. It's one that I think libraries are struggling to really position themselves where we have value and contributions, but yet we're sort of sidelined. Like, it's maybe falling into the stereotype. Libraries are more like a third space, right? Not the primary support. And so we need to be more proactive with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Other questions? And folks can feel free to unmute themselves if they'd like to actually ask Ray their question. Okay, so you have a question from Renee in the chat box.
Great. Thanks, Renee.
So, in case anyone can't see the chat box, Renee is asking, what recommendations do you have for those of us in leadership or management roles to advocate for thinking beyond the data and making decisions because data is biased, incomplete, racist, doesn't address the complexities that Ray addressed in his talk? Have you published this work you've done, the interviews and the conversations, so we can cite it?
Yeah, this is a great question. I need to take a moment to think about this because we are very data heavy, right? Data heavy focus, try to prove that. And at the same time, we need to be critical with the data we're collecting. For instance, whose voices are we not including? Whose data and experiences we're not including? And how, and if should that be in a data set, right? Or should that be in a different form? I'm really curious if you have thoughts on this, Nicole, because you do a lot of research as well, and your take on connecting data and its issues with libraries.
Yeah, Ray, I'm with you. It's a hard one, right? We've been talking for years about libraries proving their value or demonstrating their worth, particularly when it comes to funding and other resources. And that really is what the leadership responds to. And I was just having a conversation with another colleague today, even in library education and also for libraries that do hiring. We have a very distinct notion of what data is, and a lot of people only think it's quantitative. And so, it's part of that. How do we also tell that story? And it goes right back to what you were saying about CRT and storytelling. How do we make sure that people know how valuable qualitative data is? And to Renee's question, I think this is a longer term answer, that people aren't going to find qualitative data as valuable until they understand how powerful it is. So that's another part of the education and outreach that we need to do.
Right. And so I think back about my own research process, and I wonder whether they would have shared that level of extent if it was a survey or some other like metric that didn't dive into their experiences and stories, right? That gave them a chance to really share in a trusting environment, right? In a safe environment, that what they're experiencing, that it wouldn't get back to them, right? Oh, they really like their libraries, but they also had some issues, and these aren't necessarily. I don't want to say grievances or anything, but there were patterns coming out from the barriers that they were experiencing, and I wanted to give them an opportunity to share that, not necessarily where they have to type it out, which is ironic, right? If you're trying to capture digital divide experiences and you're giving them surveys to fill it out online, well, what if they don't have access, right, to it? And so there's some of those trickiness with the data collection. So you really have to think about, right, your audience and finding ways to, does it make sense, right? Like, is
Yeah,
this the appropriate step of collecting it?
yeah, absolutely. Katrina Davis Kendrick, one of our colleagues who does wonderful research, concurs and says, I think the experiential data is so important. It can really shift the lens. And I just lost her comment. Can really shift the lens through how we talk about these issues. All right. So you have another question from Nicolette. And Nicolette is asking, how do we get librarians into those spaces where the digital divide issues are being discussed, especially public librarians? Any tips on this specific outreach?
Yeah, great question, Nicolette. I think it's important if you want to start with the ALA policy group. There's a lot of different work that they're doing. The policy advocacy group in Washington, D.C., they're focusing on national issues on broadband. But if you want to also focus on state level issues, check your state chapters. They're definitely a legislative monitor who is also a librarian, usually working and monitoring issues that are affecting the state in terms of library-related matters. Broadband is going to be one of them for sure, and you could be in touch and see where are the channels they're subscribing to. Of course, there's like other things you could do, like setting up RSS feeds kind of thing and tracking in your local news what's being discussed. I think it's worth exploring with those who are doing the work at the moment, so that they can give you more advice that's catered to your area, right? Otherwise, if you're interested in federal stuff, there's plenty of work that ALA in DC they're doing.
Yeah, excellent. Comment from Karen Downing. Karen's at the University of Michigan. Says on our campus, qualitative methods are gaining recognition for what they bring to understanding. Even our medical faculty are begging for more opportunities to learn qualitative methods. And in parentheses, where double blind quantitative studies have long been king. Absolutely. And just as we're waiting for another question, and to kind of Nicolette's question, it just reminded me as Ray was speaking, it's Ray, and correct me because I think you posted it today, the research design seminar series, and there are several professional development opportunities to help people learn how to do research, and focusing on qualitative methods. And I think not that we don't have enough to do, but how can we help others learn how to do this research? And I don't know about you, I didn't take qualitative methods in my master's level education, certainly in PhD level, but it's part of what we find that we need to do as information professionals more and more. And so, how are we kind of filling that gap if you didn't have the opportunity to take it in your formal education? So, lots of professional development opportunities for research happening now as well.
Yeah, I also want to stress for those who are practitioners and trying to do this kind of work for your institutions, you might want to position it as user experience, user-centered work, so that in a way it's tied to customer service or patron support. Because I think when maybe if public libraries, if they're thinking research, what, like they already say this is not, this is not necessarily aligned to, what you're supposed to be doing. However, if you say it in a way that is related to supporting the services, right? User service, user experience is big. You want to improve and enhance, right? Your policies, your services, and resources. And I think that might be one way to think about that.
Absolutely. Thank you. So Bean has a question. Bean says, thank you for your work. Thinking about addressing the digital divide in terms of access and the potential for making high-speed quality internet a public utility makes me think about quote unquote net neutrality and efforts to fight policies and technologies that it just jumped up. Sorry about that. That exert surveillance and social control over target or marginalized groups like Black organizers, sex workers, etc. Are there data equity campaigns or work being done that also incorporates this kind of work to protect privacy?
Yeah, I can share this resource, the Library Freedom Institute, LFI, which I'm also part of a member. They have the Library Freedom Project, which is great. A lot of interesting things rolling out in terms of surveillance and privacy matters. They have a lot of resources in terms of whether it's related to privacy or health surveillance. Like there's a lot of things that are coming out of that group, and I would encourage all of you to check it out if you're interested. I can't go specific in the question here because I immediately that one just jumps out. I would have to think a little bit more on other ones.
All right, thank you for that. So Helen wants to know, what would a call to action look like for teens and youth? In school libraries, stakeholders are often swayed by student voices.
Yeah, I think what I shared is quite applicable to everyone, to the extent of everyone sharing their stories, their experiences, and really collectively advocating for digital equity, inclusion, and equality. And for those who are in teens and youth in school libraries, I think if you're able to really get those stories out there, in terms of if you do have people who are really deeply affected, in your communities. Get those stories out there in an op-ed or some sort of way where people can see how this is an issue. Get it to your legislators, see how big of an issue it is. It's one that you really have to think about, right? Because it's also they're not adults, so you have to get their consent and then make sure that their parents are okay with it to really share how they're being impacted. And when they're not able to do their schoolwork, I mean, it is just really devastating, as we're finding out. There's a lot of lagging and behind, and some people I've seen on social media have even joked like, oh, everyone should be like held back 1 year because it's just been like so disruptive. But I don't know if that's a cynical. I mean, that cynical way of thinking is actually helpful. I think it's also one where we really can start addressing it and get funding issues. And if we don't raise it, then corporations might have a voice and say something and then dictate how things can be done to support broadband that might not be supportive of your schools or youth and teen. I'm just thinking out loud here because it is a really good question that I hadn't thought about before.
Yeah, for sure. I think you bring up so many great points about it's a fine line, right? And so I think it again speaks to us as information professionals trying to be as proactive as possible, so we can be part of that solution and say, yeah, that might not work. And, having all of this corporate sponsorship, et cetera. Renee says to this question that it really could be some powerful youth development work to encourage students, young people, to think about how this issue is affecting their now of school experience and also their future. Okay, are there other questions? We still have some time. Okay, while we give it another minute or so to wait and see if any other questions emerge, as I don't know if everyone saw the message in the chat, so I'm going to put the link again. This is the site for the Spring 2021 Baker Diversity Lecture Series. Ray's profile is there, along with the suggested readings that he mentioned during the talk. And in a couple of days, as soon as we can get everything processed, we'll have the video up. Ray, if it's okay with you, we'll have a PDF of your slides. So you'll be able to go back and revisit so much of the wonderful information that Ray shared with us today about this very important topic. And you'll also find information about the upcoming lectures. We have a total of 10 this semester with some really amazing people, and so happy that Ray was able to kick us off this semester. Thank you, Renee.
Yeah,
go ahead, Ray.
Oh, no, I was going to say thanks again, yeah, for the invitation and for being able to showcase this type of project I've been working on, thinking about. And I did want to mention this experience that I've captured here in this presentation will be published in the Urban Libraries, Urban Libraries Journal, open access in April. So I just signed off, did the last thing yesterday, so people can get a better idea of the constraints we're talking about, and then some of the stories and quotes that people are sharing, the users I interviewed, and hopefully will think about their own policies and institutional structures and services, and how do they prioritize, right, their resources to support those user needs.
Yeah. Teresa, it's Urban Library Journal, and it's an online publication. Ray, when it comes out, please send it, and I will definitely link that to that your profile. And that's a really great journal. And I would say that even if I hadn't published in it and Ray wasn't in it. But I want about this journal and really about the speaker series in general this spring. For the most part, we have an amazing list of speakers that are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I think particularly for our profession, we have to have more of these voices. Just as Ray said, listen to BIPOC scholars and professionals. And we need to continue doing this work and continue telling the stories. So it won't be so hard for us to get and maintain these seats at the table, because it's, I'm sure everyone on the call has familiarity with that experience of a BIPOC professional, in particularly in libraries, being the one or the only, and it's hard, right? So then someone asked about leadership and management. It's very easy to dismiss the stories or concerns of one or a very small amount of people. So, as much as we can tell these stories and share the research, I think the profession is absolutely going to be better for it. Okay, so are there any last minute burning questions for Ray?
I'm scrolling back up too in case I missed
Yeah,
any of the
yeah, please.
comments.
Yeah, no, they're all wonderful. Amy says in particular, and I just lost Amy's comment. Amy says in particular, I lost it again. But thank you so much for doing the research on this topic. And I think you are filling a huge gap that we have, and really kind of directing us about some of the trends of important conversations that we need to be having.
Right. And I wanted to mention when I did my literature review for digital divide studies, like it goes back decades and decades of people trying to understand who has access. And it came from a perspective that didn't include people of color. Like it was just really interesting to see how they collected the data quantitatively, right? And instead of like qualitatively, it was sort of like a census kind of thing. I mean, there's like a whole history, the historiography of the digital divide is it's quite a complex issue there. And as a result, I started saying, well, I think there needs to be more qualitative research, not only that, but like including the critical race framework to really understand how are people experiencing digital divide issues. And as a result, I started seeing, okay, this is a possibility. And there has been some research, some dissertations I've seen, like Dr. Stacy G. Hollins, who is a dean in one of the business schools in Virginia. I looked at her dissertation, and she coined the term digital denied, and it's really interesting
Oh,
looking at
interesting.
African American community college students, and then how some of them ended up going to the public library to do their schoolwork, but they experienced barriers and constraints too.
Mm-hmm.
And so that gave me this idea, like, okay, we kind of need to think about some of the students, especially those who are in academic libraries, not realize maybe before COVID-19, they were probably going to their local libraries, right? And then experiencing some constraints similar to the ones I shared with like time access or internet access and so forth. And so because they didn't have access to the internet at home, they went to the public libraries, their community college was too far away. And she also applied a critical race framework. And so we had a conversation actually about it. And so it was quite interesting. And then I brought it up on public library users of color, and then just to see what are the issues that people were experiencing, the barriers, and then those were the ones that really stood out.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. This has been amazing. Thank you all so much for coming, and sharing in this wonderful presentation with Ray. And thank you for your great questions and discussion. It has been a pleasure to spend this time with you all. Next week, we have Dr. Beth Paten from Syracuse University. And then the following week, we have Dr. Aisha Jones from North Carolina Central University. And I think and I hope that you will find their presentations as enlightening as Ray's. And so keep an eye out on the site for more information. And Ray, I can't thank you enough. It's always a pleasure.
Same here. I'm so glad to have been invited and being here with all of you, even though we would maybe might be together at a conference or
Right.
something. But this is great. And thanks for moving the slides and
Oh,
working
no
with.
problem. My pleasure. All right. Thank you, everyone. Keep an eye on the site for the recording and the PDF, and we will meet again soon. Everyone be well and stay safe.